this episode of the Football History Rewind, we discuss more from the 1921 season, including the rules on how to start a game, put the ball in play, and the adventures of a tiny Washington and Jefferson team that shared the national title that year. It's all coming up and more in just a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history on a day-to-day basis. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time. So as we come out of the tunnel of the Sports History Network, let's take the field and go no huddle through the portal of positive gridiron history with PigskinDispatch.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of PigskinDispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal to positive football history. And as we stay on course for our year-by-year look of football History Rewind, part number 43 is coming at you, and we are staying in the year of 1921. We're going to have a few more episodes in this very interesting year in football, because college football, that was the rules of the day. Even for the professional level, they followed the NCAA rules at that time, all the way till 1933, if you remember. Now, football was at a very dynamic game, and especially the aspect of the rules of the game, as we said. And these rule revisions have been a very dominant feature of the game since the late 1800s and are still very prevalent today. And the year 1921 was no exception to this trend. As a matter of fact, that season featured rules revisions that still have some big merit in today's contest with Pigskin. At the last of the edition of the series, we discussed a few of these changes in 1921 as far as players being urged to start to wear numbers on their uniforms, and even explored the views on cleats and helmets in that era's rules. This part of our study on football rules history will really hone in on the balance of the rules revisions from 1921. Well, very interesting enough, it appears that the first revision to be discussed is that a portion of the game that happens right from the start in today's football games, the coin flip. Apparently, this is the first year of football where the rules officially incorporated the flip of a coin called by a predetermined captain of one of the teams in order to choose how to start the game. According to the National Collegiate Athletic Association's Football Rules Book of 1921, sponsored by Spalding Athletics, the rules of the coin flip were revised to conform with the most custom way of deciding who would get the ball first and which end of the field. The rule said this, quote, Rule 7, Kickoff. Section 1, the referee shall toss up a coin before the game in the presence of the captains of the opposing teams, first designating which captain will call. The winner of the toss shall have the choice of goal or kickoff, which choice shall not be revocable. If the winner of the toss selects the goal, the loser must kick off. The loser of the toss shall have the same privileges at the beginning of the third period as the winner of the toss had at the beginning of the game. Unquote. Now, the first glance of this procedure is still practiced almost to the letter, but today there's a little twist deep in the language. And when read carefully, it's interesting indeed, as it states that example that if the winner of the coin flip chooses to select the goal they want, then it forces the loser of the toss to kick off. That being the case, I would think that would have been very seldom indeed for a captain to have chosen to kick off, as they were in the essence would have no choice in that matter of fact. Now, the captain that chose the goal to defend also received the kick. Now, this was corrected probably a couple decades ago, and actually when I officiated in high school level, it was still almost the way that rule was written back in 1921. There was no deferment. And what happened was, if you get a captain out there would get a little bit confused, he would say, hey, we want to defend that goal. And at the beginning of the game, well, they wouldn't get a choice in the second half, and it made for some very irate coaches. So I think the deferment option is a great one that was incorporated. Now, looking down further into Rule 7 of 1921 in the NCAA, it states that after a goal was scored upon a team, they had the choice of receiving a kick or kicking off to their opponents. Well, that sounds kind of odd, doesn't it? Now, this was an already established rule and not a revision in 1921, but nonetheless, I do not see where a team would willingly choose to give their opponents the ball again after they just scored points to that team. Not totally sure what the rules makers were thinking of with that portion of the rule. Now, there were some more rules of putting the ball in play. We already talked about the coin toss, but in rule number 14, section 9 of the 1921 NCAA rules, they had a revision which seems to almost be foreign to a person with knowledge of the 20th century football. This part of the rules dealt with the ball going out of bounds, other than on a kickoff, and how to put it back in play again. The rule states that a player of the team which is entitled to the ball, not an official, would walk the ball in from the sideline to the point where the ball crossed the sideline play prior to the right angle of the sideline in the presence of the referee to a distance of that player's choice, as long as it was more than 5 yards but less than 15 yards from the sideline. Clearly, the concept of hash marks were not used at this time, as in today's game. It's also very odd that the player would bring the ball in and spot it rather than an official. Now, we do know that prior to this, there's photographs of the ball, the center snapping the ball right next up to the sideline. So I guess this was a little modification to that. The NCAA also revised Rule 14, Section 13, where it is mandated that after a touchback, the ball would be placed on the 20-yard line, and a team that made the safety would be awarded a first down. This rule revision still stands as written almost a century later. Now, Section 14 of that same rule, number 14, had a revised recipe for putting the ball in play after a safety. The team that made a safety would be awarded with a new series from their own 30-yard line. Yeah, this revision in 1921, as we well know, had to be changed one or more times in the last 9 decades to be what it is today. But the fathers of football, they were trying to find the right formula. They were planting the seeds of wisdom and change that would be reaped by later generations of rules committees to make football the great game it is today. Now, last episode, we talked a little bit about the collegiate season of 1921. And we pointed out that there was a 6-way tie in the record books to who the 1921 collegiate champion of football was. Officially, the NCAA Division I football records, as we'll remind you, lists that the California Golden Bears, Cornell Big Red, Iowa Hawkeyes, Lafayette Leopards, Washington and Jefferson Presidents, and the Vanderbilt Commodores all shared in the 1921 title. One of these teams, the W&J squad, has a very interesting story that we want to try to remember here. The President's head coach was Earl Greasy Neal, and he's a figure that we see has come up in football history time and time again, not only at the collegiate level, but at the professional level. He most famously coached the Philadelphia Eagles in the mid-1940s and even served as a co-coach with Walt Kiesling during the war merge season of the Steagles team, where Philadelphia and Pittsburgh merged their professional teams during the war because of lack of players because many of them were overseas. Now, Greasy Neal made his mark in coaching with the 1921 collegiate W&J team, though, as they went 10-0 in the regular season. They defeated such teams at the time as Pitt, the University of Detroit, and Syracuse. Now, the victory over Pittsburgh in particularly was celebrated with public speeches, a bonfire, and even classes being canceled at the school. This perfect record and impressive wins against quality opponents gave Neal and the Presidents the honor of being considered the top team in the East that year. And with that distinction came the invitation to play in the Rose Bowl game. The excitement in the air was electric and intoxicating. School president Robert M. Murphy even ended up putting a mortgage against his own home to pay for tickets and transportation to get himself and 6 family members out to Pasadena to watch the game against the University of California Golden Bears. Heck, the school itself could only afford to send 11 players with its trip budget, which sounds very radical indeed. Now, the Presidents were good, but did not have a very deep roster, and the roster situation did not get any better, and it actually got a little bit hairy for Washington and Jefferson. During the train ride to Pasadena, in which Greasy Neal continued to prepare his men, Lee Spillers caught pneumonia, and he could not finish the journey. They ended up having to stop him there and put him in the hospital and I think send him home. and not wishing to miss the game, Ross Bucky Buchanan, a reserve player not sanctioned by the school as one of the paid tickets to California, had actually stowed away on the train and was fed smuggled sandwiches by teammates there. So, as luck would have it, he was available to fill in Spiller's roster spot. And as a matter of fact, they were the last team in Rose Bowl history to play only 11 men for the entire game, because that's all they could really afford to send over there. And thank God for Buchanan smuggling his way on the train. Well, the game ended in a scoreless tie at the Rose Bowl, but as one of those where the underdog small school presidents should have and could have won the game. The first opportunity that slipped through their hands was one of the most controversial plays in Rose Bowl history. An apparent touchdown run for W&J was overturned by an official for an offsides penalty called on Wayne Brankert's dash for the end zone. A second and possibly even more golden chance to score was when W&J's Hal Eckerson slipped and fell on his way to a sure touchdown. What a bad break there for them. The Washington and Jefferson only had an enrollment of 450 students, and this earned W&J as the smallest school ever to play in a Rose Bowl. I don't think that mark will ever be touched. Besides this, the Presidents also made their mark on a couple of other firsts for the granddaddy of them all game. The W&J's Charles West was the first African-American quarterback to play in the Rose Bowl, while Herb Kopf was the game's first freshman to play. Remember, freshmen weren't able and eligible to play in varsity sports, but W&J being so small, I think they listed as an exemption, only having 450 students at the school. With all of that, perhaps the most interesting portion of the 1922 Rose Bowl game were the stats. The Presidents rushed for 114 yards. Well, that sounds, decent. I think that's been done before. But the Golden Bears were held to just 49 yards of rushing, and W&J held Cal to 0 yards passing and only 2 first downs the whole game. So California only had 49 total yards of offense, and they had outscored opponents by like some 200 points during the season. So that's quite the standard there that W&J accomplished. And we told you that 1921 was filled with change, personalities, and entertaining football. The 1921 rules book was still very much under the influence of Walter Camp, and in the next edition of Football History Rewind, part number 44, we will examine a portion of the 1921 rules book that Mr. Camp really shed some foresight on. So when we come back, just probably later this week, we'll get that part number 44 to you. And sure glad that you were able to join us for this little bit of history in the 1921 season, because it is so richly filled with all those exciting little tidbits that we like to hear and want to preserve. So hope you'll continue to help us preserve football history by listening back day in and day out as we bring you football history each and every day here on Pigskin Dispatch. Till tomorrow, everybody, have a great Gridiron Day. That's all the football history we have today, folks. Join us back tomorrow for more of your football history. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? You should check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Pictorum Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. Instead of a boring old tie, get him a historic baseball photo taken by Henry High Sandom at the historic Polo Grounds Stadium in New York City during the 1894 Temple Cup. Or, if he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL poster. These are so good looking that you'll be amazed how they turn out. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order.